Hey, welcome to another episode of Power Athlete Radio. I'm John Wellborn, 10-year NFL athlete and founder of Power Athlete, and I'm joined by Mr. Chris McQuilkin on Power Athlete Radio. Great to see you, Chris.
Thank you very much for having me, and we are joined by Mr. Rob Exline, nutrition research nerd, most jacked coach over 50 years young, and a Power Athlete nutrition coach. Rob, welcome.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You just released a blog on powerathletehq.com all about hydration.
Mm-hmm.
And with football season officially underway, two-a-days, it's 100 and fuck outside in Texas. We brought you on to deep dive the importance of hydration on performance.
I was going to say 104. It's been consistently 104 every day for the last 40 days.
Yeah, it has been repressive. It's terrible.
Yeah, a little bit more humid in H-Town. It
was super humid today, but it rained. As soon as I walked out my door, the humidity hit me. But has it been humid down in Houston?
Oh, my God. Yeah, you can almost taste it. It's so thick. I just spent a week in Ohio, though, and it was a real nice break. So
I feel like anybody goes anywhere is nicer. My wife and kids went to Florida to visit her mother, and I stayed here, thank God. Make sure the house is fine. And they were in Florida in Fort Myers, and Kate's like, it was legitimately 15 degrees cooler and not nearly as bad as what we're dealing with in Texas. So when Florida is nicer than Texas in the summer, that you got to say something.
Well, through high school football, which we have a hotline question connected to it, that's where men are made in Texas high school football. Case in point. That's a joke. I'm terrible. All right. So here's our question, Rob, and this is directed your way. Important connection to the blogs. Are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. I have a 16-year-old son playing football in the South. It's hot. It's humid this summer. I'm worried about how the heat and humidity will affect him with two-a-days in practices. They try to make it easier on the kids with early morning practices and then coming back later in the evening. I want to make sure he is prepared. What should we do as far as nutrition and recovery between his practices?
It's a good question. First of all, we'll talk about the hydration piece of it. Just because football is one of those sports that, especially in a hot and humid environment and all the equipment, as I'm sure John can attest, that's going to help hold the heat in. And that's where, problems start to happen, right? So, then also the hot and humid environment, as you sweat is supposed to evaporate, and the sweat evaporating is what really cools the body temperature down. But in hot and humid environments, and I can attest to that, coaching in Houston, you just have a thin layer of sweat on you forever. Just because of the humidity, and that also holds in the heat. So from a perspective of being hydrated, and since he is a teenager, and teenagers tend to be dehydrated anyways, just because they're in growth phase, and kids in general are typically chronically dehydrated, then we should address that first. So they definitely want to make sure, ideally you would 4 hours before you would start to hydrate. But if it's an early morning practice, you're going to have to hydrate in the evening, and then also just before. But you start there. I think one of the other things that should happen is really need to assess. And to assess, you want to weigh yourself and also monitor the color of the urine. So you want to make sure that your urine is like a pale yellow. If it's too clear, you have too much water. If it's darker and brown, you're pretty much dehydrated. So if you can kind of monitor those two things, then you're going to be on your road to be able to make sure that you're hydrated. As long as it's pale yellow, you're good to go. And then post practice, you want to make sure.
Let's stick with We can break this into.
No, I was going to say, if your pee looks like Guinness, and I know because this has happened to me many, many times, where after a game or after practice, you come in and you go to use the restroom and you're like, ooh, that's not a good color. That's a big problem. And you got to, start, pounding the fluids.
Well, a big splash on the internet about 5 years ago was the University of Texas Longhorns hydration chart, where they were aiming for championship hydration levels, and above all the urinals at Texas's training facilities, they had these charts. So you had championship hydration levels, selfish teammate. We're getting into a darker shade of yellow. And then blatant disregard for your teammates. You are headed to Area 51. And then essentially the Guinness, the dark brown. You are a bad guy.
I disagree with that on so many levels.
Well, this coach is no longer at the program.
The interesting thing too, when you start, I didn't really learn about, like the color urine in relation to rhabdomyolysis until I, got into that whole deal with CrossFit and it became an issue. And I remember one of the telltales for rhabdo was, your piss looks like, root beer was kind of one of the, ways they described it. And as they were explaining it to it, I was like, ooh, I bet you I've given myself rhabdo on numerous occasions. The problem is it's probably dose related. Like, the first time you do a tequila shot versus, years later of drinking tequila, you don't
or a glass shot.
Yeah, same deal. But I really think that idea of hydration, the one thing that, and I'd like Rob, if he can jump on this, is the idea of sodium. When I came into the NFL, they used to give us salt gum, like these little round, look like basically like gumballs that were salty, and you would drink them and salt and chew them. And then all of a sudden they got rid of that, and they were just trying to give us nothing but these Gatorade electrolyte packs. And I'm really happy, especially with Element and what they're doing in terms of hydration and salt, really pushing salt back to the forefront. I always thought that Mother Nature's figured this stuff out much better than we could in terms of trying to enhance it with all the Gatorade. But just water mixed with a little bit of salt, I thought was a much better deal. And I never really liked the taste of Gatorade anyway. So I sometimes think that, pounding the Gatorade and especially the sugar that they were giving us ended up working
before practice. Yeah.
Well, just at all times. Like I would have done better with just water, which is what I always drink, and the salt gum than pounding all the Gatorade, because there was an idea for every pound you lose, you have to drink one of these Gatorades. And it was just so much sugar. I just felt so bloated out. If I drank it, it just didn't seem to work. So the issue came down to, in practice, you want to drink enough water to kind of cool your mouth, cool your body off a little, but you can't drink so much that you become, get a slosh in your gut. And then that completely kills you. So you almost have to under drink a little bit so you can still go out and perform, but not drink so much that you get gut slosh.
Yeah. Speaking of drinking too much, I was a health sciences major. Basically everything that we were taught, course went 110% with it, including hydration. So there was one game I was so hydrated that I was throwing up all the water. So this is before we even left for the road game. Just on the college house balcony, just puking my guts out in mid-afternoon daylight, and then go to my athletic trainer, and he's just like, you're an idiot. And what he did, we didn't have salt tablets, gums. It was leaning on fruit with hydration. So like apples, oranges, because it just focusing on you can't drink any more water, but in order to keep you ready for game time in the afternoon, later in the afternoon, fruit.
Well, the other one too that I disagreed with is the idea of, and you'll hear ATCs and trainers and people be like, if your mouth is dry, you're already dehydrated.
Oh yeah. I wrote that in the show notes because it's too late.
It's stupid.
If you're thirsty, it's too late.
It's stupid. I always felt that if you're thirsty, you drink. If you're not thirsty, don't drink. So if I wasn't thirsty, all I would do is just basically take the water, deal, and I would just hose out my mouth, spit and make sure that my saliva wasn't gummed up. And then I just went on with it. And just because I felt, and I saw this all too often, they would push hydration on people so hard that they got gut slosh and then dudes couldn't play. So I almost was a little bit better, just like eating before a game. I would undereat a little bit because I wanted to be hungrier or a little thirsty more so than satiated and full and well hydrated. I just never felt that was a good position for me to be in.
And Rob, you brought up urine color and then weight.
Mm-hmm.
So these are two very important things that we can give to the parent to start making a habit out of their kid, for measuring the hydration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a couple things, and I want to actually circle back to a couple things John was saying there. Especially with regard to the Gatorade. The issues with the Gatorade, and that was probably just a sponsorship deal, right? They were sponsoring things, and so they were pushing that onto you. But really what you found and what, probably other players found and other teammates found was that whole issue of the bloatingness and, gastric discomfort that comes with those things. Now, one advantage of those things is that they actually have taste, and it does allow people to, drink, because some people just don't really like to drink water. And then the other thing that I wanted to kind of touch on with that was the individualization of it. And I think what you found, and I think that's one of the mistakes that coaches and potentially parents make and players make, is that it's a general prescription. Here, go drink all this water, or go drink all this other, or Gatorade, or whatever they want to kind of push on you, versus, what does the individual need? Because it does come down to individual sweat rates with what John was referring to in the sodium. Some of us really dump salt. Like when I coach here in Houston, hot, humid environment, if I have one of the black shirts on, when that thing dries, there's just salt rings, right? Just so, I'm somebody that I need water and electrolytes like sodium for the most part. Other people may not. So the individualization of it is super huge. And then going back to your question, Tex, about the wane and the urine color, a couple things that, there's the dehydration as it gets into problem areas of heat injury and low salt hyponatremia. Those two things are interesting because the signs and symptoms are very similar. But one thing that should happen is actually after practices and games and things like that, you should actually weigh less, right? Versus weighing more. If you're weighing less, then you've lost fluids. If you're weighing more, you've lost salts. And so, right. So because what's happening is the water's coming in, but it's not actually being used and shuttled around. And so now all of a sudden you're weighing more. Right. And that's where you get into that hypernatremia, which is, too little salt. Right. And so, and both of those things carry risks and issues, and they're misdiagnosed all the time, right? Someone comes in because the symptoms are very similar. And if they don't weigh them and if there's no baseline, if I didn't weigh myself, then I don't really know am I heavier or am I lighter? Because if you're heavier and you just keep pumping fluids down, now you're going to get into some serious issues. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, yeah, I didn't know if we weigh more, because we've observed some D1 football programs, and then weighing is a big part of theirs. I didn't know I just assumed if my weight went down, I'm dehydrated. I didn't know if it
well,
goes
you thought
up.
if it went up, you were, hey, I've hydrated myself.
Well,
no, what's interesting is there is a direct component of salt and water for absorption. If you don't, like you said, if your salt is low, your body can't absorb it, and then that's where you get the gut slosh. So, I mean, that was a big contention I had, where I was like, dude, you guys are pushing these fluids. And for me personally, I always thought the Gatorade made my legs feel heavy. And I know it's probably, there's no scientific data to support it, but I just know, anytime anybody ever saw me on the sideline where they went to hand me a Gatorade cup, it was full of water. And if they gave me a Gatorade, I just kind of pushed it by. I just never liked it. And I think it was because it made my legs feel heavy. Now, if we were going to go out, I wouldn't mind mixing Gatorade with some like a vodka or something. I thought it was a pretty good mixer. But in terms of like hydration,
what are you, on the back of a Division III lacrosse team bus? It's classic.
Well, in college, what we would do is we would take the big Gatorade containers, and then we would steal the powdered Gatorade, and we would make Jungle Juice, where we would just buy all the cheap booze we could, mix with Gatorade, some water, and slosh it, and then make those. And that was actually a good use for it. I just didn't like it for hydration.
John, you had experience with the Eagles playing in the hottest game in recorded NFL history.
Yes.
And y'all had a different approach on the Eagles sideline than the Cowboys. Take us through that.
Yeah, September 1, we played the Dallas Cowboys in Dallas at noon in Old Dallas Stadium. So that was when they had it was a dome, but they cut the roof out.
Cut the roof out so that God could look down on America's team.
September 1 at noon, we had that game. And when we showed up, the NFL health team came in and told us, they were like, we just took temperature. The ambient air temperature outside is like 110. but the sun's directly overhead and the turf is at 163.
Jesus.
So they were like trying to decide, like, do we call the game? Do we not? Like, what do we do? And they were like, no, you guys are going to play. Here's the caveat. If you get hurt, don't lay on the turf because it'll raise your core temperature and we're going to have problems.
Oh my God.
So we go out there and it's legitimately like 160 plus degrees on the turf. And our trainers knew that we were going to have issues. So they actually sent a bunch of manager kids out to the local grocery store and bought pickles. And we're actually on the sideline pouring pickle juice in our cups because they didn't have salt gum. And so it ended up becoming called the Pickle Juice game because we were drinking pickle juice on the sideline. But the crazy part was they had to stop the game at one point because the guys that were holding the down and distance markers kept passing out. And then they would have to like kind of get somebody new and cart them out. And every time they came out for a TV timeout or a water break or, whatever we had, I would squirt water in my mouth and then I was squirting it in my shoes because my feet were burning. And I was trying to cool my feet down. And then I got to the point where my shoes were so wet that they were kind of like sloshing, but it didn't matter because they dried in seconds. And but then the one saving grace we had was when the sun shifted. So obviously, the sun was going to the west. It actually put us in the shade in the third and the fourth quarter and was shining on them.
What idiots.
Yeah. So they had umbrellas over them. It was awful. Like, and it was one of those things where it was so fucking hot. Like, you just kind of mentally turned off and just thought like, I just got to survive through this and get through. And we ended up winning the game, thank God. But I remember walking off the field and like taking off my clothes and like everything was like, every ounce of my pads, everything, like, I had to cut my gloves off. The socks I had to cut off. Everything was like just disgustingly sopping wet. And it was a nice sense of accomplishment to win that game and say that you got a chance to play in that game.
Yeah. And didn't the Cowboys have several issues related to cramping and hydration?
Yeah, they did. The other weird thing too is that old stadium had one hell of a crown in it. So because the
on the field,
so they would get, obviously they get kind of weird torrential rain here in Dallas or in Texas and in Dallas especially. So they put a huge crown on it so that the field would drain. So at one point I think we were going down into our end zone and we were on the left hash and we had to run we ran like a sweep to the right. And I remember I legitimately felt like I was running uphill and I was like trying to get my legs to move and they were burning and my feet were like sloshing. And I had this like weird feeling that I was doing a hill sprint. And then I got to the top of the hill and then I got momentum running down it. And I don't know if it was the heat or if I was just mentally exhausted
or dehydrated
or really dehydrated. But like, I remember feeling like I just ran uphill and I ran downhill. This is the worst fucking field I've ever played on. And the worst part is it was the shitty older turf. So it was extremely hard. I played against Leon Lett that day and pitched a shutout, which was good. As you guys know, Leon Lett, they call the big cat. One of the best defensive linemen to ever play in the NFL, but ended up being kind of marked with infamy where he was running in with a touchdown on a fumble.
Oh yeah.
And
that's him.
Yeah. Don Beebe knocked it out of his hand. I think it was Don Beebe. Yeah. Knocked it out of his hand. And so, but what people forget, obviously bonehead play, that dude was an absolute monster. He was a very, very big, strong, fast, athletic dude. And that was my first NFL start at guard against him that we came out and played that game. And so that was a fun day.
Fucking pickle juice.
Yeah,
pitch and shutouts.
Yep.
Well, heat exhaustion, I'm sure you observed it and the decrease in performance. And Rob, in the article, you explain more on heat exhaustion. So like what, if I'm an athlete, I'm going through the shit, my coaches are telling me water is weakness, what can I feel and look for that would be sign and symptoms of heat exhaustion?
Yeah, sure. A couple things. Clumsiness, confusion, dizziness, flushed skin, clamminess, cramps. That's an early sign. Nausea, vomiting, rapid breathing, rapid heart rate, that kind of stuff. Stopping sweating is a huge one for like really getting close to dangerous things. But as John was saying there, that whole running uphill and not sure if it was the heat or whatever, one of the things with dehydration is that things will feel harder, right? So your rate of perceived exertion is going to feel harder. So things are going to feel difficult if you're low in water. And what they have discovered is that even a 1% drop in body weight can decrease performance, and that shows up in a lot of ways. If someone is dehydrated, decision making is going to be compromised. Even skills are going to start to compromise. And then, soft tissue or even non-contact types of issues can start to happen, because while it's not, hydration is not necessarily, I mean, muscle has lots of water in it. So if you do start to get dehydrated, that's where some of that comes from. But they find that even in cutting sports, that being dehydrated can lead to non-contact type injuries, especially in like an eccentric type of contraction, stopping and cutting. Those types of things can start to happen. So,
I think
like
you're making excuses for the Houston, Texas performance and all the summer and August camps that they have. Because we've had a couple Texans on the pod, and they all say the worst preseason experience of their careers.
Dude, I mean, the guys in New Orleans, they would go down to Thibodeau State. I mean, the players, like, it's pretty universal, but Houston's not a good place. Rob, is there a direct correlation between hypertrophy and hydration and salt and all that? Have you dug into any of that stuff?
No, I haven't really dug into that too much. I haven't dug into that, so I can't really comment on that. I think at the end of the day, though, where dehydration comes into play with muscle action is fatigue, right? So over time, if you're dehydrated, you'll have fatigue, and so potentially not being able to contract as strong and as powerful, which is why you see some of those injuries. But
the kind of almost like the cliche bodybuilder walking around with like the gallon of water. I mean, the Rich Piana 5%ers, they used to sell water jugs that said 5% on, which was hilarious. You could just write it on there yourself. Their whole deal was that like only 5% of the population is willing to do whatever it takes to be
to drink a gallon of water.
Yeah, or whatever their lifestyle was, which was steroids and cocaine and other crazy shit, which I think ended up
5% then seems high.
Yeah, that feels a little high that there's people that are willing to do it, but I might be butchering what the 5%er is.
Probably.
I probably am.
It's just steroids and cocaine.
Yeah. That's what Rich Piana ended up passing away from. Was
steroids and cocaine.
Yeah. Well, he took a ton of steroids, and I think he ended up dying. Heart stopped due to blowing lines.
Dehydration.
Yeah. Live fast, die young. Leave a good looking corpse. But they're the classic bodybuilder. You see them walking around with a huge gallon of water, and this idea of like constant hydration. I don't know if it's they're doing hydration to try to flush the liver and the kidneys. Maybe it's for for whatever reason, but enough of, and maybe it could be just fucking bro science where like one big bro was real thirsty and walked around with a big jug, and then all the smaller bros and broettes figured, fuck it, if that big guy's got water, I'm going to do it too. But I wonder if there is some correlation. I know sodium obviously makes you the thought that too much sodium makes you retain water, which I think we've kind of debunked a little bit with the idea that, Stan Efferding, we had on the podcast, talked extensively about, sodium for health and heart. And there's also definitely a correlation between heart disease, heart attacks, and the recommendations by the American Heart Association for low sodium diets, which if you get into that book, The Salt Fix.
Yeah. Can we spend some time there? Because that's probably a common thing that people have now accepted as truth because it's pushed on them. So what's with sodium, water retention, bloat, all that normies buy into?
Well, I think the reality is sodium is pretty tightly controlled, right? If you have a lot of, if you've ever had salty meats, right, and all of a sudden you feel like your mouth has been like shoved with cotton balls and there's dry, right? That's an indication that you have too little or too much salt in your bloodstream. So your body's like, okay, give me some water so I can dilute it a little bit. But the reality is we excrete a lot of sodium in urine and feces and sweat that that's not as a big of a deal, and that's potentially, I haven't read the salt fix, but it's potentially, they talk a little bit about that. But I think the reality with like hypertension and things like that is it's people eating processed foods that have like ridiculously high amounts of sodium in it, right? Like, so because of um,
Shelf life.
Well, there
yeah,
is
shelf life and things like that.
well, I mean, there is some research poll that talks about serum sodium levels help identify adults with a greater chance of experiencing heart disease. So, I mean, hydration and people that tend to stay more hydrated with better sodium levels tend to experience less heart disease. So there is a correlation between that. I, man, the salt thing's pretty interesting in that, especially with the hydration. Maybe the correlation isn't necessarily that there's a 1-to-1 correlation with like, if the muscle's more hydrated, you have a better chance to put on more muscle. Maybe it just comes down to the fact that when you're more hydrated and you drink more water, you can push harder and you have greater capacity to effectively be able to push through and create greater mechanical tension. Also, I believe there is some form of correlation with stronger contractions and hydration and salt as well.
Well, I think I would agree with that. And sodium, I believe, and sodium and calcium are pretty involved in muscle contractions, and that's why you see people that have an electrolyte imbalance and they get the cramping,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like for myself, I discovered this several years ago. Coaching 7 classes a day in a hot and humid environment. And I would drink water all day because I was thirsty, and it never really quenched my thirst. And what would happen in the middle of the night, I'd have one of those ridiculous hamstring cramps that get you out of bed and make you walk around and do kind of the Chris Farley, ooh, ow, kind of thing, right? And
Charlie
you're like,
horse. Yeah.
yeah, the Charlie horse. That and so once I started just doing electrolytes like Element, I never have that issue. Right. So, and that's just basically the muscle getting stuck in the on position, and it's contracting and it can't stop. It's almost like the heart quivering in a heart attack kind of thing, similar type of thing. Right. It's just in a contraction that it can't get out of, because it should get out of it at some point.
Now late in games, so coaching high school athletes, later in games, it's Texas heat. Like then we start to see cramps come up. So now in games, in practice, to prevent this, should we lean on the pickle juice and the push? Do oranges come into play?
I think the pickle juice, which has got a high sodium content, or finding some form of salt supplement. I think today, I mean, if I could redo it, I would have something like Element. I mean, we drank pickle juice, but having something in the water that's a pure more salt and has some form of magnesium in it. The other issue too,
and parents are going to default towards Gatorade.
It's crappy. I mean, unless I can't necessarily comment on like they have like 0 carb Gatorade. Well, actually, I don't mind, or Pedialyte's another one. But for me, this is another one, and I didn't realize this until I had kids. Going number 2, especially for your kids, and when they get sick, let's say, and they become dehydrated, all of a sudden they can't go number 2, and if they do, it's like shit in a pine cone. So keeping your baby hydrated so that number 2, because one of the things, and anybody who's listening to this that has kids, if your kid gets constipated, it's a bad day. Like you're not sleeping, like it's going to be awful. And like you feel terrible for these they can't figure out why they can't go. And my kids got dehydrated. They were throwing up. They couldn't go number 2 in this. And like, so we started pounding the fluids. And that's why you want to constantly keep your kid pretty well hydrated, the sippy cups and the water, because it ends up making number 2 work well. And I didn't, and it happened to me on certain occasions where, you get super dehydrated, you're in training camp, and the one telltale sign that I didn't drink enough water and I didn't do enough for hydration was you go to number 2 and end up having an extremely painful experience. And the joke is like, dude, I'm so dehydrated, I'm shitting a pine cone. And I've been in that situation, and that's a terrible one. So the idea of like staying hydrated and making sure, one, it's allowing your body to have their body functions work well, because dude, there's nothing worse. And I'm just telling you guys from personal experience, there's nothing worse than struggling to go number 2 and then having to go out and play for 3 hours in pads without feeling like everything's working well and feeling a little nervous on that. That was a bad one.
Yeah, I had a teammate, older teammate, and would die on the sword of like a laxative during like essentially our camp leading up to, because he couldn't go during camp, and he's like, "You're gonna," he didn't say you're gonna dehydrate. You're gonna need this because you're not gonna be working properly, and leaned on laxatives.
Well, that's because
to deregular, but he was just fucking dehydrated.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
I'm sure he was,
yeah,
drinking natty lights at night.
But the idea, I mean, like, if you're drinking alcohol, that actually dehydrates you even more.
It's light beer, John.
Yeah. Well, but that like there's some really interesting ones that, like that, where, people talk about hydration and this and performance, but like to make sure that your body is functioning right. There's nothing worse to be in camp for 4 or 5 weeks and like feel like, man, I blew out an O-ring or something bad's happening. So like that type of fighting for hydration and making sure that you're, sleeping in a cool room. That was another big deal. Like we slept in dorm rooms. So bringing our own personal air conditioning unit. So it was nice and cool.
Yeah.
Because there's nothing worse than sweating the whole night than having to get up and go bang it out in practice.
Yeah. I did want to touch on sleep. Just observationally, when I am dehydrated, my sleep is shit. So like is there science between the connection of sleep and hydration, or is that just personal experience?
Well, ask anybody that's ever had gone out for a big night of drinking. Have you ever had the most restful night of your sleep after drinking a bunch? No. And if you guys can see Robbie shaking his head because he knows. I mean,
not at all. Yeah, I think it's really kind of what John was saying there is that water is really essentially the most important nutrient that we take in, just because 60% and even up to actually 60% on average, but it could be 40 to 80% of our body is water. And if you think about it, we could go days, weeks, maybe even months with little food, but we can only go a couple days without water, right? And then we're dead. So that it is important to keep all your functions functioning correctly because it's used for so many things. So I think it's more about it's like driving your car without oil, right? If you don't have enough water in you, you're driving your car without oil, and that's a terrible thing.
Or
right?
Without enough in your radiator. Yeah, you don't want to blow a radiator, and all of a sudden, what happens to your engine if you can't cool it? I mean, it's the same deal. You blow a spring in your radiator and end up overheating your engine and cracking your block, and you run into a lot of issues. Rob, what have you looked at any of the stuff with here in Texas, like the tap water is pretty interesting in that they end up putting a lot. They end up putting some interesting stuff in it. So we end up having a water filter, and it filters out stuff and puts stuff in. So we end up with a water filtration. The other big one too that I'm in the process of reading was it Shauna Swan's book, Countdown, that talks about leaching plastic in our water sources. The idea that bottled water has been bottled in plastic for like 2 years before it gets to us. By the time it gets bottled and gets to where we are, so it's been sitting and soaking in this idea of plastic, and now we're consuming it. That's another interesting piece where not only are we fighting for hydration, but now we have to almost take a step back and be like, okay, where's the water you're getting from? Are you drinking out of plastic? Are you drinking it? Is it coming from tap water? Like now we're in a situation where are you drinking water is important? Are you drinking salt? But more importantly, where is the water coming from? And am I getting it from a good source?
Yeah. I mean, I guess anecdotally, I've looked at that, just knowing, I personally like my water bottle is a metal, like steel kind of thing. And I like that. I used to have one that had a glass insert, which I think is actually probably the best thing. And we have like here at the gym, we have a water filtrator with ice and all that. So I feel pretty comfortable about mine, but I would agree that, we need clean water. And I'm sure that a lot of municipalities put lots of things in the water that we're not sure of. And I really try to stay away from bottled water as much as possible, unless it's just a situation where I can't have my other water bottle close. So, but from an anecdotal thing, that's really what I've dug into, not necessarily into the research about that.
Yeah, no, I'm super, after reading this book, I'll never, drink out of plastic again. I mean, to the point where like, you know, we have a water filter. I would like to get a water filter down here at the barn, but also one in the shop.
Great.
We will. I do. I believe me. I've been looking for them. And being, you know, the idea we have it tapped in too. I just got to hook it up. But the idea, like just the waste associated with the plastic bottles, it drives me absolutely crazy. Like seeing them all over. So we got to figure a solution for that.
All right. We got some cool takeaways. I did learn a lot. Was operating on a lot of just assumptions here. So Rob, hit us with the big 3 takeaways that our listeners need to apply to either their own training, recovery, or help lead their kids in the right direction rather than just Gatorade.
Sure. The big things is, you know the signs and symptoms of heat stroke and heat exhaustion, and also hypernatremia, or hyponatremia, too little salt. I think also just making sure you're assessing, weigh and monitor your urine before and after practices. And then also making sure that you're rehydrating afterwards. So whatever you lose in body weight, you should replace, right? And really, it starts with about 1.25 liters to almost 2 liters of water to replace those fluids. And as it's appropriate, based on your individual sweat rates, electrolytes. If you're super salty, then you're definitely going to need to have salts and electrolytes, and of course, Elements is a great tool for that. So those are 3 takeaways.
And if you want to expand on this, have excellent reference points, Rob's got a blog on powerathletehq.com. We also offer a lot of awesome nutrition tools if you want more than hydration. So head to powerathletehq.com and check out our nutrition page for protocols, leaning, bulking, performance associated with those 3 big goals. And if need be, you have the opportunity to work with Rob and Sam, our nutrition coaches, to help get them tooled up and empower your performance. So, thank you, Rob.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on another episode of Power Athlete Radio. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.